April meeting of Galaxy Hobby Sci-Fi Club. While John is plugging in wires, I'm just going to get started. Mike doesn't seem to have any new stuff to show off, so I thought we would probably introduce anybody new, but I don't recognize anybody new. And then...
Isn't that the point of somebody being there?
If you don't recognize them, then if you recognize them, then...
Yeah.
Okay, whatever. Bob.
I have a question.
Sure.
How come you're up front and you were so painfully shy, showing off your models? You always stood in the
Bob,
back.
if you'd been making it to
talk about
meetings,
it.
you would have already gotten through all
I just want to know how this transformation's happened because it's awesome.
It's the miracle of caffeine.
Okay.
And then because if you don't follow through on your threats, people don't fear you enough. I'm going to talk a little bit about scratch building as I promised to in the
Awesome.
and then we'll have show and tell as usual.
Okay.
So I don't see anybody new, so I can start talking about scratch building now, I suppose, huh? Okay. I gotta get Mike to turn down the lights. Hey, can you get Mike to turn down the lights where the mic is?
Hi, Gil.
I could do that for you.
There's Terry's back there.
Well, I'll sit next to you.
I put on deodorant this morning.
So I'm recovered.
Okay.
So this is mostly some stuff I threw together about 6 months ago when it became apparent that my talk on painting figures with oils had run its life. So a few thoughts about scratch building, and I'm Steve Hilby, as you know. First I'll talk about tools, and I'll talk a little about the process of building a model, and then I've got a whole bunch of tips that may or may not be familiar to you. The first tip, which I'm kind of out of sequence here, is magnification. If your eyes can see it, your hands can do it. Your hands are capable of much finer work than your eyes can discriminate. So get yourself an optivisor, and if you're an old fart like me, get yourself reading glasses and an optivisor, and your work will improve a lot, just like that. Tools. Always buy good tools. I never skimp, I always try to buy good stuff. I use a scalpel instead of an X-Acto knife. The scalpel's blade is thinner, they're disposable and fairly cheap. Hi. And it's easier to handle because the blade is flat and not round like an X-Acto. I have an aluminum block that I built in college. It's just a flat plate of aluminum, but it's square and it's flat. So I use it as a straight edge, I use it as a square, I use it as a flat surface to build stuff on. Punches. Hex and round punches are very useful if you're going to do scratch building, anything with detail. Toothpicks. I use them as trowels, I use them to sculpt things with. I use them as paint holders, and every now and then I clean my teeth with them. When I bought a miter box, that was wonderful. All of a sudden I could cut off tubing, square and straight. It was wonderful. So buy yourself a cheap miter box out here. I have a syringe with latex caulk I keep on the workbench. I have another syringe with acrylic gloss medium, heavy acrylic gloss medium in it. And then I use a lot of hemostats, those little clamps that they use when they cut you open to keep you from bleeding to death. They're great for holding stuff for painting. Any questions so far? Paul.
Are you going to cover the tubes with the latex caulk later?
I'm going to tell you what the latex caulk is right now.
Oh, wouldn't lead in, huh?
John, did you have something?
What's the
It
caulk?
was the same thing. Instead of epoxy.
No. So this is Aventine. Aventine was built up like a layer cake. Each layer of rooms was a circle, and I stacked them all together. When I did this test, you notice that there's a lot of light leakage around the tops of the walls and stuff. So when I put it together finally, I took my syringe full of latex caulk, and I put a fine bead of caulk around the top of each wall. And when I put it together, that blocked all the light leakage over the walls perfectly. The latex caulk is not translucent, it's very opaque. It was super easy to do because I got a fine line using that glue syringe.
Does it stay? It doesn't harden in the.
No, it stays. There's no air in the syringe, so it stays liquid for a long time. And it's just latex, so if it gets where you don't want it, you get yourself a Q-tip with some water and clean it up.
So do those syringes come preloaded with the caulk, or do you have to-
No. You buy empty syringes, and I just have one of those big tubes of caulk out in the garage that I use to patch things with and squirt the syringe full of caulk.
Okay.
Where do you throw away the tube of caulk, because it's gonna be dry next time you wanna use it.
And you can wash out that syringe when it's empty.
I could, or I could just throw
Yeah,
it
soap and water.
away, they're super cheap.
Yeah.
Where do you get them? The syringes?
I think I bought them online, yeah.
Get a white lab coat, walk through the hospital. You can
There you go. They're just white plastic syringes. I'll talk a little bit about the process. This is kind of the process I follow. There'll be some sketches and some brainstorming. There'll be a first mock-up, then the engineering where you try to decide how you're gonna build it. Then you build the basic shape and then you kind of detail it out. I think this is a pretty common process. So you're not gonna see anything too insightful here. Am I audible at the end of, back of the room?
What?
Ken's video showed me that I don't talk loud.
Yes, you.
Okay, so sketches and mock-up can be very rough. You don't need to be an artist. All you have to do is be able to draw a box, right? This is my spaceship, and this is the gun that's going to shoot it down. So that's a circle and a tube. I mean, that's no big deal. At the diorama level, attention to aesthetics early, very early, makes for a better project, rather than finishing a tank and saying, oh, I guess I better put a figure next to it. What the hell am I going to put next to it? I know I've got a British, that's silly. Plan way in advance so everything can be integrated through the whole build process. And you don't have to have the tank done. All you have to do is have a little box you can set on the table. Okay, that's my tank, and this little blob of clay, that's the man, and if I put him here again. So you mock it up with rough stuff, using stand-ins for the finished bits. Shep is a god. Shep Payne wrote the best damn book in the entire world, How to Build Dioramas. And if you don't have that, you should buy a copy, no matter how much you have to spend for it. Engineering, you got to choose what materials you're going to build it out of. The most common are brass, styrene, maybe wood. You got to think about routing of wiring, which drives people crazy. I watch poor Ken tearing his hair out, trying to figure out where he's going to run wires those damn little things he builds. You got to think about supports. If it's a spaceship, you don't want to just lay it on the counter, so you want it to be up above the counter on a stand of some sort. If you put your batteries in the base, which I kind of do now because it's easier to change the batteries without screwing up the model, you have to think about getting the wiring up through the supports. If the model's not supported at the CG, it's going to want to spin around the support until it's at the lowest point. So if you use a keyed support or a square tube, you can support a model not at its CG at a slant, and it's not going to want to spin around until it's out of position. Then you got to kind of think about how to handle multiple things. All my projects involve having to build a lot of one type of part. So there's ways you can do that. You can just gut it out and build them all. You can cast copies. You can do photo etch if the part is suitable for that. Yeah, I have a picture of a keyed socket. So what I've done in the past is a support rod is a chunk of solid acrylic rod. I saw a notch in the end of it, and then there's a plastic tube socket in the model with a brass pin that engages that notch. And that keeps the model from spinning around the tube. That Edwardian aerial house car that I built, the green thing, it's supported way off the CG, and if it weren't keyed, it would flop around until it was way out of the way I wanted it to be. Repeatability. If you're going to be scratch building stuff, you want to be able to reassemble things without error. You're going to be taking stuff apart and putting it together and fitting it together and taking it apart, fitting it together, and you want to do that the same way every time so you know where you are. So you want to pin things. I usually use brass pins so that when you put a piece on, it goes on the exact same way as the last time you had it on. And I usually use brass for pins. I read on the internet about people using nails and stuff for pins, but nails rust, and rust expands, and then you got cracks and crap. So I use brass, which is pretty much non-corrodable and super easy to work with. I was clever with styrene pins once. I had two halves of a wing and I had them pinned together, but I used a styrene pin. So when I glued the wing together, I just snipped off the end of the styrene pin and sanded it down flush, and then I didn't have to worry about, I don't know what you'd have to worry about otherwise.
So why is brass best only usually?
Well, because if you want super strength, you would probably want to use steel, despite me just telling you shouldn't do that. And if you have a pin that goes through something, like a model where you've pinned on the shoulder by drilling into the shoulder and into the body, and the pin is going to be sticking out, you might want to think about styrene that you can just snip off and sand down flush, especially if it's not a lot of strength you need.
Yeah.
And then a reference plane. I think I talk about this in the next slide. Yeah. When I was building the interior on this device, and the first thing to do was to set up the floor level. So I drilled some holes through the bison, and I put in 2 brass rods just as close to parallel as I could, and as close to level with the axis of the bison as I could. And then when I built the floor, it laid on those brass rods, and I could measure from those brass rods to see how tall the various furnishings had to be. I set up a reference plane that everything else on the model was measured from for squareness and symmetry. Okay, basic shapes. Most of us do an amalgamation of existing shapes, kit bashing. So this is a motor I built. It's a couple jet engines, a truck transmission, a tank part, and then a Gundam vernier, just to show that you can find stuff practically anywhere. This angled tube here is 2 pieces of tubing cut angled with flanges glued on and some gussets and then some punched bolt heads. And so you build your basic shape, and later on we'll talk about detailing that out. The other way to build basic shapes is just build the damn things from scratch. These are the panniers for the Middle Grosses Kriegsrad.
Do you use punches to cut bolt heads with?
Yeah, you can get hex punches that'll cut a little hex circle, as it were, and those are the best thing in the world for making bolt heads. That said, hex punches are insanely expensive. Last time I looked, it was $100 for a set capable of making 9 different sizes of hex bolt head. If you got to make a paper pattern to fit up against the curved surface, you know, the average 6-year-old would take a piece of paper on the curved surface and say, well, it looks about like that, and then they take their scissors and go snip, 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 and see if it fit against the curved surface. But we're smarter than that. We take a small piece of paper with a little bit of curve on it, fit that against part of the surface, then we take another small piece of paper and glue that on to fit the next piece of the surface. You make your pattern in pieces, and it goes a lot faster. And then locating blocks, if you're on a curved surface like this and you're trying to put a floor in, for instance, you want to have a locating block so that floor always goes in the same place instead of flopping up here or sagging down there. And again, it's repeatability. You want stuff to go together the same time, the same way every time you test fit it. And then dividers are useful for transferring measurements from here to there and making sure things are symmetrical. We all know how to use dividers, I hope, right? Okay.
Not the math dividers, right?
Now we get to the fun part, the tips. Making boxes. Plastic rectangular tube with a piece of plastic glued on each end. Here's how to make a box any size you want. Cut one end of the strip square, make that kind of swastika shape, and trim afterwards. To put boards on the side, little bits of strip, trim afterwards. So the key to all this is you build it rough and you trim it and sand it to shape after it's all glued together. That's kind of the key to precise work, is doing your cleanup after it's glued together. Yes, Gil?
So when you're cutting, if you have a sheet of plastic and you need to cut that sheet so that it's repeatable every time, do you make a jig and have a special tool that maybe somehow slices that sheet?
If I want to make a set of ribs that are all the same, what I'll typically do is I'll take a bunch of plastic in the rough shape, glue it together with little dots of thick super glue, and make a stack. And then I'll use a jeweler's saw, which is like a super delicate coping saw, to cut all that stack at once. And then you can slip in between the layers with a knife and pop them apart. The super glue is not very strong if you use little dots of it. So that's how you make a bunch of ribs all the same. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, like you say, if you have to cut a bunch of things all the same length, you can make jigs. We'll talk a little bit about jigs later on here. Very little bit. Plank on frame, you can make some kind of complicated shapes. So you make a frame. This is the spine of Aventine, and it was made with a bunch of elliptical bulkheads in 080 plastic, laid out in PowerPoint, because you can draw nice ellipses in PowerPoint, sawed out with a jeweler's saw, and then strung along a brass rod core. And then the planks were quite thick. I think I used 080 plastic for that because I knew I was going to be doing a lot of sanding, trying to get it smooth afterwards. Another shot of this, the joints between planks, the ends of the planks you should arrange to fall on bulkheads. So if you accidentally press down in that area, they don't pop in and pop the joint loose. You want to support the ends. And then again, you cut them long and rough, and then after the glue is dry, then you trim them down smooth and even. And this model, I put a brass socket in there at that point too for the stand. I knew Aventine was going to be supported in an unbalanced position, so I was going to put it on a square brass tube stand to keep it from spinning down and hanging like a pendulum from its stand. Let's see next. Can't help. There we go, plank on frame 3. Now a guy that I know did this kind of the hard way. He built up a bunch of bulkheads on a aluminum tube core, I believe. And the bulkheads weren't round, they were all faceted. And then he cut a bunch of football-shaped splines to put on there, which is really slick. You can get a really nice effect that way. He made a small mistake in the width of his spline, so he had to do the whole thing twice, because he put them all the way around and then ended up with an oddly shaped hole. But man, it sure turned out nice. This is yours, Steve. You know that. Yeah, we've all seen the model too. Plus it has your name there. Wood. I generally avoid wood. The grain is, if you're going to have the grain exposed, it's out of scale for almost everything. And then moisture problems. Wood is always sucking up moisture and letting it back out again. If you have a painted wood surface, eventually you'll see micro cracks in it because the wood has been expanding and contracting with the moisture going in and out of it. I used to know a guy who built airplane museum level airplane models. A couple of his models made it into the Smithsonian. He told me he didn't build them out of wood if he could possibly help it because of that problem. The paint job would eventually go to hell because the wood was always expanding and contracting. However, wood can be useful if you cover it with plastic all over, and the plastic provides you a useful smooth surface that you can paint or sand or glue stuff to. This is the base for a flying machine. It's basically a wood armature with sheet plastic over it. It had paper shingles. That seemed to be the cheapest way to do it. I took a piece of heavy light cardboard, smeared it with drywall mud. When it was all dry, I cut it into shingle shapes and then slapped them on one at a time, which was an experience. This is the base for the Mars gravity probe. Again, this is a fairly simple wood shape, all cut out on my bandsaw. My bandsaw is the greatest tool in the world for creativity in wood. And then just covered with styrene sheet and a hole drilled in it for the acrylic tube that holds up the Mars gravity probe. The raised lettering nameplates, I was told how to do that by a great sculptor at Wonderfest. You order a rubber stamp, and then you make a resin copy of it. But if you just order a rubber stamp, it's going to come with the letters reversed, so that when it stamps, it'll make a forward reading thing. So you order a rubber stamp reversed, and then when you copy it, you get that. So you send in your art to these guys, and they'll do it for about $20. Makes a really nice nameplate. Detailing. Gizmology. Tank road wheels are forbidden under the General Scratch Building Operating Agreement 12.2 because you can't do anything with them that it doesn't look like a tank road wheel. You can purchase details. The rivet decals by Archer and Micromark are insanely useful. The Archers are a little finer and a little thinner medium than the Micromark, but the Micromarks are so much cheaper you can sometimes resign yourself to their crudeness. Railings and stairs, of course, are available in the model railroad department. A stairway makes a pretty good louvered vent if you need a louvered vent for the end of a gable on a house or something. Gundam bits, there's probably hundreds of little boxes of Gundam bits available on HobbyLink Japan. You can buy verniers and vents and all sorts of weapons. What else can you get? You get spikes, whatever the hell they use spikes for. And then Shapeways, you can go to Shapeways and look for things that you want. Or you can actually build your details if you're a real masochist like me. So now we take our basic engine and we gizmology it up a bit. We had some plumbing made out of solder. Don't use acid core solder because the acid will reappear sooner or later and booger up your whole thing. So use solid solder. Use lead foil strips to make details. A bunch of punched bolt heads there. And then I used some rockets because I had them. Anyway, now there should be some kind of rationale. You say, okay, well that's the atomic part and these are the turbines and I'm going to run hot air from the atomic part into the turbines, and you kind of think about what it does and it looks a little better.
Steve, a couple
Sure.
questions on the lead foil.
Yes.
Do you put the seam when you wrap it around where you can't see it, so it's really hard to line it up? Or do you butt it? Do you overlap it? How do you glue it on there?
I've got a slide in which I talk about lead foil for a couple seconds. Can we put that off until I forget about it at the end of the presentation?
I'll bring it up again.
Okay, anybody else have anything to say? Bob?
Aluminum wire I've been using is a lot better for me than solder because it's not quite as soft. And it comes in a lot of different sizes at the craft store.
That's working on.
And if you're making rubber hoses, you take the aluminum wire and you shrink tube it. And then you can make hoses rubber hoses that stay in shape. So,
That's a cool idea.
Building mini parts, okay? You gotta build a whole bunch of little doodads. Again, like we said before, you can cast them, you can photo etch them, you can build them all. Things like the chopper, which allows you to whack, 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 whack a whole bunch of pieces of plastic exactly the same length. Very useful. And then the punches that I've already plugged. Micromark offers a set of round punches that are fairly nicely priced. The RP Tools hex punches are slicker than all but Jesus, but I was only able to get them from England because English have all the best stuff through Hysterex agents. And they're fairly expensive, but you know, if you want to do this, treat yourself to some good tools. And then jigs are useful if you're trying to do something the same way every time, like glue something together or sand something to a certain thickness. Castings. What I did here was I kind of cheated. This is all furniture for Aventine, so I bought some masters from Shapeways, some N-scale furniture. We all know Shapeways stuff is not cheap by any means, but then I just copied it. I made a one-part mold and cast a bunch of copies of it. And again, this part here, I needed 6 carburetors. I modified the kit part to make the master, and then I made what I call a semi-2-part mold. You just suspend the carburetor, pour it into pour a block of rubber around it, then slit the rubber with a knife, and you get a mold that kind of opens, I don't know, like a peach would. And then you mold, open it, pull the piece out. One of the advantages to that is you don't have a parting line that goes all the way around the piece, which you got to clean up like you would if you had a 2-piece mold. And also the parting line tends to be very narrow and fine, easy to remove. So we can talk about, okay, what materials do I use? I use silicone rubber molds, the blue stuff you can buy from TAP. I've messed with urethane molds, but it's kind of stiff and it tends to tear. The silicone rubber molds seem to work a little better. I use polyurethane resin from TAP, it works great. Or Galaxy Hobby, I understand, has this. Clear polyester resins are generally a bust. I haven't had much luck with getting them to cure, so the heck with that. I use a clear epoxy resin. I've used Pabeo Gadeo, and if you keep the temperature around it warm, if you're above 65, 70 degrees, it sets up nicely, it dries to a nice gloss, it sets up nice and hard. And after you pour something in a mold, you scrabble around a bit with a little wire in the bottom of the mold to dislodge any bubbles, and they'll come floating up to the surface. Mold making. I think we've seen this before, but anyway, the one on the left is a good and a bad way to cast a head. If you cast a head like on the top, an air bubble is going to form in the tip of the nose and in the underneath the chin. Whereas if you cast it from the back of the head, then you can tilt it and the bubble in the nose wants to naturally bubble out. Also, you can poke in with a piece of wire, like I said, poke in here and try to dislodge those air bubbles so they'll pop out. But the pour spout on the back of the head didn't bother me because I was going to make hair for that out of epoxy putty afterwards anyway. And then this is a really slick mold I made for casting high-heeled shoes with feet on them. This is probably the best way if you can afford the rubber to do it. You have a separate pour sprue. You pour on the left there, the resin flows up, fills the mold from below, and the air is naturally flushed out as the mold fills. And then there's a basin there. When that basin starts to fill with resin, then you know you've got enough in the mold. And this particular one, I was able to stick a reinforcing wire up through the high heel to strengthen that and also provide a way to hold the figure for painting. So that's the best way, is to fill the mold from below and let the air be naturally flushed out as you fill the mold. But it takes a lot of rubber, right? You can tell this mold is a lot bigger than if I just made it with the shoe alone. How are we doing? Am I talking loud enough? Have I intimidated you all into not asking any questions? Because I'm sure trying. Okay. This is my electrodes project. This was for Aventine again. I bought some electrodes, and I thought they were going to be fine, but I looked at them and they were kind of crappy, so I figured I'd better build my own. So I had some Delrin laying around, because don't we all? And I turned that on a lathe, because don't we all have a lathe? I turned a master, made a resin copy again in one of these kind of split molds that I like to use. Made a bunch of resin copies, drilled all the way through, a wiring channel / mounting post out of aluminum tube, and then there you are. Now they have clear acrylic balls on the top, and I'm sure you're all interested in how to drill a hole through the exact center of an acrylic ball.
That is a
So-
pain in the butt.
Here we go. You take a big drill, and you drill press, because we all got a drill press, right? And you drill a hole in a piece of wood that's clamped to the bed of the drill press. Then you set the ball on that hole, put in a smaller drill, and drill into the ball. And this big hole holds the ball aligned underneath the drill, and you can get it centered on the ball. Works pretty well. Is that clear? Did I explain that okay?
Can we come over to your house and use your shop?
And borrow your hex punches?
Only to trash them and not return them.
The problem with coming to my house is I'm likely to insist on feeding you, which you would not enjoy. I was rebuilding in Auburn, and I needed to put on new side trim. I wanted a nice taper on the trim that goes back on the boat tail, and I wanted both sides to be exactly the same. It's hard, very hard to take a strip of plastic and just, by hand, sand a nice taper on it. So I built a jig box with a slanted floor, and then you slide in the strip, sand it down flush with the top of the jig box, and you get a nice taper, and you can do it again and again for as many tapered strips as you need. So this one little tool that I spent maybe 15 minutes building saved me an immense number of headaches. Don't be afraid to take time out from building to build a tool if you decide to
What
do
did you
it.
build the frame of?
This is all I built it out of styrene. This is just styrene strip basically. It was super crude, super easy to do, super cheap.
So how do you keep from sanding the top of the jig off while you're sanding the
Well,
strip?
you could do that, right?
Yeah.
But the jig is a big stout piece of styrene,
Okay.
and the strip you're trying to sand is just a little narrow piece. So it's going to sand away well before you start digging into the top of the jig.
I was fooled by the scale of your drawing. I apologize.
Next time I'll draw a Coke can in there. Okay. This is a jig for making circular trusses. I laid this out in PowerPoint with a whole bunch of evenly spaced lines. I made some hoops by wrapping several turns of a very thin strip around a bottle and soaking it with glue and then sliding it off the bottle. Laid the hoops on there, and then one hoop was this diameter and one hoop was this diameter, and I glued them down to the paper pattern with Elmer's glue, and then I just laid in a whole bunch of little short strips as an X in each of these squares here, and this is what we ended up with. Now I could only bear to make about 2 of them, so the model has partial, you know, I made 2 and then I cut it in half, and now I got 2 of these things. But that's what they look like when they were done. And again, you make a jig, and all this stuff, it's easy to make. It's easy to get good results if you spend a little time building a tool first. This is a pretty common technique. This is a wrap box. So you make 2 bulkheads, and you hold them together with a bunch of rods in between, an I-beam in between. To make the bulkheads the same shape, you use dabs of thick super glue to hold 2 pieces of plastic together, cut them out at the same time with a jeweler's saw, sand them to shape at the same time with your sanding sticks, then pop them apart by sliding a knife in there, and you get 2 identical bulkheads. Now you want to arrange your spacer blocks so that you've got one right at the surface where the wrapping sheet is going to meet. So you can glue both ends of the wrapping sheet to that, and they won't, flex away from each other. One thing that tends to happen, I can't point because I don't even talk, but it'll tend to saddle. The wrapping sheet will tend to kind of saddle in here. So if I was doing this right, I would have put another spacer bar between there to kind of hold the plastic up there where it wants to saddle in. So the more spacer bars, the better, actually. And then my bulkheads were kind of thin, so I glued a strip to the back of them for additional gluing area on the sides where it was going to be flat. So that model was right there, and it turned out pretty well, I think. So this wrap box is, well, shit, now I'm going backwards and forwards. Wrap box is a very good way to make it. You can make round wrap boxes, obviously. You can make ovals. It all depends on the shape of the 2 bulkheads you cut out. Very versatile. Jeweler's saw. There's a jeweler's saw. Looks like a little coping saw with a little tiny blade. And then this block of this piece of flat wood here with a V-notch is how you use a jeweler's saw, right? You lay your workpiece over the V, and then you saw on it with the saw pulling down, and it supports the workpiece. And it also makes a dandy workbench for soldering. It gets the stuff right up next to your eyes, and it goes on fire, and then you have a lot of excitement. It's pretty great. So this was designed with a cleat on the bottom that clamps into my desk vise, into my workbench's desk vise. Any questions about that? Okay. Lighting thoughts. This is a follow-up that I did. Before gluing an LED to a surface, paint the surface black. Paint the insides of all lit areas black. Caulk your joints, or else you'll end up like this. Now the Lunar Cruiser has a ceiling in the upper compartment, and it has LEDs glued to the bottom of it to light the rooms. And the back glow from those LEDs out the back goes through the ceiling and creates hot spots in the hull of the Lunar Cruiser. So if you look at the Lunar Cruiser at night, it's going to have glowing areas in the skin. And if I'd had any brains at all, I would have painted the inside of the fuselage black, or painted the top of the ceiling black, and that would have killed that. But I don't have any brains, I just charge ahead. When I need to diffuse the thing, I use thin styrene, usually 005, 5,000 styrene to make a nice diffuser. I've heard of using paper, but paper has kind of a grain structure to it. You don't get a really even glow, you get kind of a mumbly glow, if that makes any sense. Tube clamps. Here's how you build a tube clamp. You cut yourself a lead foil strip, you put a dot of glue right at the center of the strip, and you lay that on the tube, and then you use your toothpick, well, we talked about toothpicks, to press the lead foil down around the tube, and then you trim it to length. And then if you want to, you can put a little bit of glue on the tip of your scalpel, slide it underneath this lead flap here, slide it underneath the flap on each side, and glue those flaps down. That's how to make a nice looking tube clamp without any particular effort. The other thing you can use lead foil for, it works really well, is rod collars. You want to put a collar around a rod, glue the end of the lead foil strip to the rod, wrap it around and around and around, touch it with super glue, and then file it so that the overlapping edge is nice and smooth in there. Super easy way to make it. You don't have to drill holes in the center of little round things, just around and around, some super glue to hold it in place. An assembly jig. I had to center a pin in a rocket nozzle and hold it upright while the glue dried, and I made this little jig until it just fits down over the tip, over the mouth of the rocket nozzle. Hole in the center holds the brass rod. By spending 10 minutes making this jig, I saved myself immense amounts of trouble gluing 6 wires into 6 nozzles. Summing up, there's nothing magic involved in scratch building. You guys can do it. All you have to do is be enthusiastic and think about what you're doing. And that's all I have to say.
Cool.
I don't know what it takes to actually turn this thing on. Okay.
Power cord.
Lights back again, right?
Maybe I looked at it.
You do the last one?